Welcome to our webinar on reasonable accommodations from two perspectives. Now, accommodations, they're really important, but they're usually smaller than this long word implies. I really have struggle spelling and typing the word accommodations. Really helpful, thankful for spell checker, because otherwise all of these slides would have the word misspelled in there. So this webinar is going to go into depth about the challenges and the perspectives of both parties involved in accommodations, those who are asking for them and those who are granting them, and how they work together. So just to keep you on your toes, the employer is who is obligated to provide them, and the employee is the person who needs the accommodation, although both of them technically need it for the person to be successful. So the objectives of this training, keep that in mind, are that people who attend this training will be able to define reasonable accommodations within the context of disability employment, understanding its scope, the legal basis, and the distinction between accommodations and general workplace adjustments. So any sort of things that we move around that aren't legally defined as accommodations. Recognizing the importance of mutual benefits of reasonable accommodations for employees and employers. Both parties benefit from these. Identifying the challenge and the pressures that businesses face in implementing reasonable accommodations, including budget constraints, operational demands, and compliance requirements. And learning the best practices for reasonable accommodation policies and procedures. Finally, attendees will understand how to creatively and flexibly identify accommodation solutions, fostering a more inclusive workplace environment by understanding the role of collaboration and communication between employers, employees, and the disability community in finding effective solutions. All right. So let's start with a poll. I'm going to launch this poll in a second. Which objective do you find most critical to your role? Defining reasonable accommodations, identifying challenges and best practices, understanding mutual benefits, learning about the legal and operational framework, or hearing examples of accommodations. I'll give you a minute, 30 seconds to respond. Oh, looks like they're filling it. Okay. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So we've got 0 people saying they're interested in defining reasonable accommodations. Maybe we're going to have to skip some of the basic stuff here. We've got 34% wanting to identify challenges and best practices, 4% wanting to understand the mutual benefits, 8% learning about the legal and operational framework, and the remaining 54% want to hear the examples. That's great, you guys. That last about half of you're going to stay to the end, because that's when we're going to be reviewing the examples of accommodations. So I am your instructor, Deb Russell Bonanno. I bridge the gap between business and disability. I'm most well known, I think, for spearheading Walgreens transformation. We had an initiative where the company wanted to learn how to employ people with disabilities in an inclusive manner that was useful, or not useful, but fit into the idea that it had to be good for the shareholders, the customers, and for the employees. It was a tall order, and I'm incredibly proud of the success that we had there. It started in 2006. I left in the beginning of 2013, and they continue to have their initiative going on. I am very committed to the mutual connection between the disability community and the business community. I think that's the only way we're going to achieve employment for people with disabilities in a meaningful way. Prior to Walgreens, I worked in a lot of different support service roles, helping people with disabilities specifically, and then working in programs that helped people with disabilities find jobs. Started as a special ed teacher. So I came from the disability community, and then have been in this very sort of hybrid role since then, looking at both sides of the perspective with this. I've been a catalyst for change, really trying to ensure that both parties in this, and again, I'm not trying to make it sound like it's one against the other, but my experience is that we really need to bring these parties together and help them understand how to work together better, how to communicate, how to collaborate. I do I speak internationally. I don't do. Let me take that back. But I speak internationally about this. Invited to speak often about this, whether it's virtually or live. And the foundational principles of what I created at Walgreens have been the basis for every company's success in employing people with disabilities, whether they used a consultant like myself to help them do it, or they read a book, or partnered with a nonprofit, or did something else to be inclusive. When you look at, you analyze what's making their success, it's what we did at Walgreens, it's what we figured out at Walgreens to make things successful and sustainable. So I'm very proud of that. And so I have my own practice now, Deb Russell Inc., and I'm just really excited to be here today. So, got another quick poll. Which perspective are you most interested in learning about today? The employer's obligations, the employee's rights and requests, or both equally? Okay. Oh, you guys are filling this in quickly. Okay. 80%. Okay, I'm closing the poll. So the employer's obligations, 22%, employees' rights and requests, 37%, and both equally, 41% of you. So it's kind of a balance. This is great. This is great for the audience. So let's get into the definitions and technical information. Some people really don't want to go through this part. I'm sorry it wasn't what you guys said you wanted to do, but it's part of the webinar. So I'll try to blaze through it as fast as I can. But let's start with this poll. Have you ever read or been briefed on the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is better known as the ADA, and its requirements for reasonable accommodations? Your responses could be yes, I'm well aware, I've never heard of it, or I've heard of it, but not in detail. Sorry about that. Or no, I'm not aware. So your choices are yes, I am well aware of this, I've heard of it, but I'm not really aware of the details, or no, I'm not aware of the Americans with Disabilities Act and its requirements for reasonable accommodations. Sorry, I kind of stumbled over reading that, so I'll give you guys a little bit more time to put in your answers. You're 50%. Oh, okay, speeding up. I guess I should have articulated that better. All right, closing the poll. Here we go. So 47% of you have said you are well aware of the Americans with Disabilities Act and its requirements for reasonable accommodation. 46% say you've heard of it, but you don't know all the details, and that's okay. We're going to talk about them today. And 7% of you said you're not aware of it, which is interesting. I'm kind of curious if any of you want to tell me why you came to this presentation about reasonable accommodations. Maybe it's because you're not aware of it and you said, hey, this sounds interesting, I need to know, or somebody told you needed to come anyway. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA of 1990, is the premier disability civil rights legislation in the United States. It has 5 titles. It's a very big piece of legislation that define disability rights. And Title I within the Americans with Disabilities Act covers employment. It created the term reasonable accommodations, and it tucked it within the definition of discrimination in words: reasonable accommodations with no fanfare, no caps, no like, hey, we're going to define this for you. It just was in there, those 2 words. And there's similar legal frameworks in most countries. The U.S. is not a pioneer in this. And most of the first world countries, those of us more developed nations, we tend to all have the similar language and policies within our legislation about civil rights for people with disabilities. It's actually globally becoming rather common. There's one differentiation about it, and that is that we want to be mindful of whether the systems that support people with disabilities require businesses to employ people with disabilities or not. That's a major difference. And it's not really in the legislation, but it's usually confused between the two. So I think it's important that you understand this is civil rights legislation that we're talking about, the Americans with Disabilities Act, was created because people who had disabilities could not participate fully in society. It was really initiated by people with physical disabilities. Some of this other stuff related to disability stemmed out of veterans coming back from wars with injuries, amputations or other kinds of injuries that impacted their ability to work. Disability has been very much associated with work until about the 70s, when it was associated with education as well as employment. But that just continued to grow in the 60s and 70s. Folks who used wheelchairs could not access the capital of the United States. This is where their legislators are present, where laws are being created, where debate about laws are being created, and part of the population could not access them, even if they could get to the building. Now, some of us couldn't access it because we couldn't get there, but and the same thing with state capitals and things like that. So folks who used wheelchairs and had other significant and obvious physical disabilities really advocated for a long time and fought a hard fight to be able to have access guaranteed to people with disabilities, that they wouldn't be discriminated against simply because they had a disability. And it really was about access. It started with access. Some of the more famous photos of this whole time of fighting for civil rights for people with disabilities shows people who use wheelchairs leaving the wheelchairs at a base of stairs and crawling up those marble steps to the Capitol, or across up other steps, or when they get to the top, chaining themselves to doorways. It was a very dramatic, and I mean that in a good way, demonstration of why access was needed for our citizens. These are people who are citizens of the United States, and we couldn't access basic things, couldn't vote because the polling places weren't accessible. Couldn't get on public transportation because it wasn't accessible. Now, that's a very small group of people with disabilities that were impacted that way, but they led the charge for disability rights across everyone within the definition of disability. And so I think that that's such a great thing to keep in mind, is that we're talking about people with disabilities, of whatever kind of disability they've got, whether they were influenced by the need for physical access, like folks who use wheelchairs or other mobility aids are, or some other way. The Americans with Disabilities Act covers everybody with a disability. So the legislation, again, has these two words just tucked in there: reasonable accommodations. So it's so subtle. I missed it the first few times I read the legislation. Not that anybody wants to read legislation, but so this is for you to know. The legislation's language says, not, starting with quote, not making reasonable accommodations to the known physical or mental limitations of an otherwise qualified individual with a disability who is an applicant or an employee, unless such covered entity can demonstrate that the accommodation would impose an undue hardship on the operation of the business of such covered entity. This is in the legislation. Denying employment opportunities to a job applicant or employee who is an otherwise qualified individual with a disability, if such denial is based on the need of such covered entity to make reasonable accommodation to the physical or mental impairments of the employee or the applicant. And the last part, this is in the legislation again. This is the first time you see the words reasonable accommodation is like buried way in this legislation. And doesn't define what it is. The last part of it, where it mentions it, it says it may be a defense to a charge of discrimination. So we're already into talking about discrimination, not enabling or ensuring access. So we're already into discrimination. A defense in the charge of discrimination under this chapter that an alleged application of qualification standards, tests, or selection criteria that screen out or tend to screen out or otherwise deny a job or the benefit to an individual with a disability has been shown to be job-related and consistent with business necessity, and such performance cannot be accomplished by reasonable accommodation as required under this subchapter. In other words, you are allowed to discriminate against a person with a disability because of their disability if you cannot find a reasonable way to accommodate them, and they're qualified for the job. So that's just it's a very contentious piece of legislation and the description of it. But the fact that they didn't start out defining reasonable accommodation, it's just sort of lopped in there, was very surprising to me and very disappointing. But it explains why it's been so hard to define this thing. So, as I said, in other countries, the disability, their disability acts, their disability civil rights may look very different than the Americans, and they tend to use the words like adjustments, supports, and productivity enhancements. To just know that typically those things are sort of just interchangeable terms until you get the real legal nitty gritty, and then you need to know whether you're talking about an accommodation or an adjustment, specifically for the legal protections related to them. But again, we're trying not to stick too much into that. So what is an accommodation? In my mind, and when I look at it in the dictionary, it's something that mitigates the negative impact of disability. That's my definition. I looked up accommodation in the dictionary, and it was talking about hotels, places you can stay, and you had to dig in there to get there. But my experience with disability is that it's a mitigator. It's that we've got an impact of disability on the ability to be successful in a job. And an accommodation can mitigate that, can negate it or minimize it in a way that it doesn't become a major part of the experience. So what does all this legal mumbo jumbo say? Those are my terms, not theirs. In general, an accommodation is any change to the work environment or in the way things are customarily done that enables, so this is about enabling, this is from the EEOC, not the legislation, an individual with a disability to enjoy equal employment opportunities. There are 3 categories of reasonable accommodations. So again, this language here on this slide is about the EEOC. And they're the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. They are the entity that has been charged by the federal government to create all the guidance about how do you navigate this legislation, the requirements of the legislation. So they say there's 3 categories of reasonable accommodations. The first one is modifications or adjustments to a job application process that enables a qualified applicant with a disability to be considered for the position and such a qualified applicant desires, or modifications or adjustments to the work environment or to the manner or circumstances under which the position held or desired is customarily performed that enable a qualified individual with a disability to perform the essential functions of that position. The third category is modifications or adjustments that enable a covered entity's employee with a disability to enjoy equal opportunity, benefits, and privileges of employment as are enjoyed by its other similarly situated employees without disabilities. So what does that really mean? Let's get to it. In other words, a reasonable accommodation may include either making existing facilities used by employees readily accessible and usable by individuals with disabilities as well, or job restructuring, part-time or modified work schedules, reassignment to a vacant position, acquisition or modification of equipment or devices, appropriate adjustment or modifications of exams, written training materials or policies, the provision of qualified readers or interpreters, and what's missing from this list? What do you think is missing from there? Okay, they're starting to come in. Modified interviews by giving a tour and having them watch another worker do the job. Work from home, moving a desk location, coming in faster, larger print materials, sign language interpreter, modified tools by building up the bulk of a handle. Oh, that reminds me of one of the coolest things I ever saw in a distribution center. One of the managers used a walker, and she needed to get up, get on, and get off of forklift equipment all the time. So she'd have to leave her walker behind. And so she'd always have to bring the truck back to where she had left the walker to be able to continue to move around the facility. And so the maintenance guys noticed that. And so they fashioned some quick brackets so she could just pop her walker on the side of the lift, didn't interfere with the operation of the equipment, and that allowed her to get off the truck and go do something, then come back to the truck and put it back to where it belonged. But otherwise, she was unable to move around. So that was just such a cool accommodation that I've seen. Let's see if there's anything else in here. Nope, that's okay. Thank you, you guys. Those were great contributions to this. So let's talk about undue hardship, because that's another part of this legal definition of disability, of reasonable accommodations, is that they don't cause undue hardship. I think that's where the term reasonable was kind of balanced with undue hardship. So again, from the legislation, not from the EEOC, apologies. In general, the term undue hardship means an action requiring significant difficulty or expense when considered in light of the factors that set forth in paragraph sub B. Here's paragraph sub B. This is how legislation reads. I'm sorry. It's not easy to read. It's not easy to understand. Factors that can be considered in determining whether an accommodation would impose an undue hardship on a covered entity. Factors to be considered include. Now, just know that the highlighting, that's mine, just so we know where these words are in the text. The nature and cost of the accommodation needed under this chapter, the overall financial resources of the facility or facilities involved in the provision of the reasonable accommodation, the number of people employed at such facility. Again, this is the definition of things that can be considered a factor for determining if it's an undue hardship. The number of persons employed at such facility, the effect on expenses and resources, or the impact otherwise of such accommodation upon the operation of the facility, the overall financial resources of the covered entity, the overall size of the businesses of a covered entity with respect to the number of its employees, the number, type, and location of its facilities, and the type of operation or operations with the covered entity, including the composition, structure, and functions of the workforce of such entity, the geographic separateness, administration, or fiscal relationship of the facility or facilities in question to the covered entity. Oh my goodness. Okay. So basically, when I read this, it says there's a lot of things that they can use to say, this is an undue hardship. It's not just about the finances. It's about what's happening in the workplace as well, which I find just really curious. So in plain language, an accommodation is something physical, digital, or invisible that supports a qualified employee to perform the essential functions of the job. It's more of a concept than a thing. So again, a lot of people think about accommodations as something that's physical. They built a ramp, or they bought a piece of a machine of some kind, or something like that, or something that you modified that you can touch. But really, it's about a lot more things than that. It is not reasonable to request an accommodation that significantly limits the purpose of a job. So we can't go in and request an accommodation for someone who can't see at all to fly a plane. Now, we can get into debates about the technology that's now available for people who can't see, and technology involved with operating aircrafts, but let's just leave that one where it is. It's not reasonable for us to consider that a person who's completely blind can operate an airplane in a commercial, in a job. Now, in the recreation, have at it, but we're talking about reasonable accommodations. Accommodations are things that are the exceptions, the things or the changes that we've made. Accommodations are intended to support a person who has just about everything needed to be successful, and the barrier prevents them from being successful is related to their disability. So they have to be qualified. That's language all over the legislation. You have to be a qualified applicant or a qualified individual, meaning that they can do almost every part of the job. It should not be some kind of an excuse to say, I'm just going to take this person with a disability and say that they should be qualified. They should do that job. And the accommodations will be to get them a college degree and to make sure that they can do this thing and to build robots that'll do the work for them. This person has to be really capable of doing the job. And their disability just has a mitigating, or needs a mitigating factor to overcome whatever this barrier is. So keep that in mind. We're going to be going through a lot of examples of accommodations at the end of this training. So since it was signed into law, it's the courts and the government and advocates have been trying to define reasonable accommodations in a very concrete way, and it's just not really working. Later in the training, we'll dig in to determine how an accommodation is reasonable or not. But let's just stick with accommodations for now. We have training on all those different terms and concepts. And this is not just a far out example about the airplane one. It was something that went into a court of law. Somebody thought that it was reasonable for a pilot who was blind to operate an airplane as an employee. So fortunately, in my mind, fortunately, the courts have decided that that's not reasonable at this point in time. Again, reasonable accommodations are not a way to find a job for anybody to do anything. You really have to do a lot of work to match whether you are the person helping a person with a disability find a job or whether you are the person with a disability applying for the job. It's got to be a pretty good match to start with, and then we'll get into the accommodations as a discussion point. So again, we'll have a lot of examples in a little bit. So the context about this, reasonable accommodations level the playing field. People use that in air quotes. I apologize, but it truly is it. If a disability is your bump and you just need something to get over that bump to get where everybody else is, you can think about it in that kind of physical standpoint, but it's also very ethereal bumps. Not necessarily physical bumps. When the disability is what is preventing someone from doing their job to the satisfaction of their employer, but something can be arranged or purchased to remove the disability barrier. So again, there's something in the way, whether it's tangible or not. And accommodations are about equity, not equality. This is so important. It needs to be individualized to meet the definition of accommodation, and it needs to be needs-based on both the employer's and the employee's perspectives part. So it can't be that it's something that you give to everybody. Now, everybody is eligible for an accommodation. When it comes to making an accommodation, it's not something you're going to provide to everybody. It can't be. What's the point? Accommodations need to be individualized. And when we go through the process of how you get one, we'll really get into that. All right. Who has these legal obligations? A covered entity, as you saw the legislation a couple slides ago, for the purposes of reasonable accommodations defined by the ADA is private employers, state and local governments, and employment agencies and labor unions. So it's pretty much everybody involved in employment, paid employment. The term employer means a person engaged in an industry affecting commerce who has 15 or more employees for each working day in each of 20 or more calendar weeks in the current or preceding calendar year, or any agent of such person. So if you have 15 or more employees and you're fairly regular of the employment you offer during the year, you're a covered entity. I think it's better to assume you're a covered entity than to try to wiggle your way through those definitions to say you're not a covered entity. Besides, accommodations help people be successful in their jobs. Why would you want to fight against that anyway? The exceptions for the term employer, it does not include the United States as an employer or a corporation wholly owned by the government of the United States or an Indian tribe, or a bona fide private membership club other than a labor organization that is exempt from taxation under Section 501C of Title 26. So you go read that tax code and see if you fit into that. But pretty much every typical employer, except for the United States government and some private clubs, are held to the standard of being a covered entity, meaning they have to offer reasonable accommodations to their employees who are otherwise qualified. So, who's protected by this legislation? A qualified applicant with a disability is an individual with or without a reasonable accommodation who can perform the essential functions of the job. That's actually terminology I took from, I think, the EEOC. Might be the legislation, but it doesn't matter. This is their technical words of it. A qualified individual with a disability is a person who meets legitimate skill, experience, education, or any other requirements of an employment position that he or she holds or seeks, so applicants are included, and who can perform the essential functions of the position with or without reasonable accommodations. again, so that it's really tied together, the accommodation and this qualified and essential functions. Those three things kind of bump into each other all the time. They're sort of integrated when we're defining this. I tell you all of this because sometimes you have to fight these fights. You need to know the basis of this so that you understand what somebody's eligible for, whether it's you or somebody else that you're working with or your employees. Back to the definition. Requiring the ability to perform essential functions assures that an individual will not be considered unqualified simply because of inability to perform marginal or incidental job functions. Say there's something that somebody does once a year, and it's such a small part of their job, but they can't do that because of their disability. But somebody else there could, without it being unreasonable. Then they're still qualified. It was put into place because people started to try to find ways to wiggle out of this. So some of the stuff you put in because it's preventing people from being jerks. Essential functions should be defined in a job description. However, just because it's written as an essential function does not mean that it will be determined so if challenged. So the Court of Laws has been involved in a lot of this to really look at essential functions and define them. They have not come up with one concrete, universal explanation for any of these sorts of terms. They just kind of be intertwined with each other and situationally individual, unfortunately. So what does that mean? Again, we're not attorneys, and nor do any of us want to be attorneys. If you are an attorney who's attending this webinar, great. Thank you. Appreciate what you do for life and for our economy and for the civil rights of people and these business entities. But this is not intended to be a legal training, although because of what we're talking about is based in the legal stuff, I got to cover that. But basically, if a disability prevents someone from demonstrating their ability to do a job, and that it can be mitigated by something, then the employer needs to offer or allow that something to serve as a solution. Again, an accommodation. It's something. It could be something you can touch and feel or buy, or something not so tangible. If there are more than one somethings that will mitigate the issue, it can be possible, I don't know why I have that type in there, I apologize, to try all of those to determine what's optimal. And decide what's causing an undue hardship. So that's the legal schmo. Let's go on to the stuff that makes more sense. Let's understand the business pressures related to accommodations. So, understanding the business pressures, the challenges for businesses around reasonable accommodations or accommodations and determining if they're reasonable are budget, operations, compliance, training and communication, and lack of expertise. These are the challenges that all businesses face in this area. This is such a small part of employment when you look at the full scheme, the full range of employment. Those are your challenges specific to reasonable accommodations. And there's potential reluctance that's kind of connected to them, and that's the perceived costs and productivity concerns and a lack of awareness and defining a process. Those are really your potential causes of reluctance within these challenges. So, first of all, let's talk about documentation. Documentation is so important to this. This is what businesses need to be considering. Decisions about what and how to collect documentation related to this process. So let's talk about why documentation is crucial. Legal compliance. Again, this is something that's defined by law. So, there's a lot of guidelines that the government puts out there about how to be compliant within their laws. So documentation is a great way to demonstrate your compliance. It offers consistency. If you're always documenting what you're doing, you can look across and say, have we been applying these things consistently? Have we been making decisions consistently? That's what documentation offers to you. Communication clarity. If you have it documented, then you understand what people were told, when they were told it, and you can reinforce that or go back and say, oh, there wasn't communication. Let's make sure we get it in there. Or the communication was fuzzy because this is what it said. Let's clarify that. So documentation offers you the communication clarity, which is important, is equally as important as consistency from my perspective. And it allows you monitoring and review. accommodations aren't necessarily stagnant things, and people's need for them aren't stagnant. So we want to be able to monitor and review every once in a while what's working, what's not working, and it offers institutional memory. So not everybody stays in their position forever, and so if you're coming in, you've got that documentation to teach you what's been come before you. Or if somebody's going to be replacing you, here's the documentation so that I don't have to explain to you the last 20 years of my life in my job. So what do you document? The accommodation request, the request that was made, it needs to be documented some way. It doesn't mean somebody has to fill out a document. It just means that it needs to be documented that the request was made. The interactive process, which we will go into, but that is really the heart of all of this, the conversation between the employer and the employee to figure out what's going to work, what's going to mitigate this barrier we've got right now from somebody being as productive as possible. And it's caused by disability. The considerations and decisions that were made. We thought about this, we considered this, and here's the decisions we made and why we got there. We considered this and didn't decide to go forward this way because of this. We did decide to go forward with this because of this. The implementation details. So we decided this is the accommodation, and this is how it's going to be created and how it's going to be monitored and maintained. All of that, the follow-up. Those are things that need to be documented in each case. And then let's talk about the best practices of documentation of accommodations. Confidentiality is key. The whole basis of an accommodation is a disability. And a disability within all other federal laws is health information. So you have to keep disability information as you keep health information. It has to be confidential. This is not something to share or to speculate about or to be discussed unless somebody needs to know it. Respect and sensitivity also. Because disability is such a personal experience for people, and because it's connected to health, there's a lot of stigma and that sort of, you have to have respect in this process and sensitivity. And that's on the side of also on the side of the person who's requesting this. We want to be respectful and sensitive from our perspective as well on this. And then finally, the best practice is to get legal advice when you need it. This is about legal stuff. We want to make sure that what we're doing is compliant and isn't going to get us into trouble. Again, both sides, employer, the requester and the business. So employers' biggest fears, this is what they told us. I did a webinar on this 3 years ago. And the employers who came said, my employee will explain the barrier and I won't know what the accommodation should be and I won't even know where to start. This is a real fear of an employer. It will be too expensive. My budget is really tight this year. You know, COVID was tough. Let me tell you, that webinar was just laced with people talking about COVID. COVID really brought people's awareness about accommodations, awareness about disability to the forefront. The third one that they told us was, it's my process. Is my process enough to protect the company and the employee? Have they created enough of a process? And I'd say in most cases, the answer is yes, sometimes a little bit overboard. And then number 4, we'll get sued no matter how hard we try. I actually had 5 members of our webinar who said that. And I was like, oh, that's depressing that that's your perspective. Your biggest fear is that you're going to get sued no matter what you try to do. And I really think that it's interesting. What else? What else? What else would there be to consider? You can put it in the chat. Yeah. How was I supposed to know if they didn't tell me? That is an employer fear. How am I supposed to know that somebody needs an accommodation if they haven't told me they have a disability or they haven't told me they need an accommodation? That is a very real fear. Thank you. Yes. So those unknowns are the scariest parts for employers, for businesses, for companies. What will be needed? What will it cost? Will it be effective? Will it work? Will it be reasonable? And will it be a long-term solution? These are the scariest things. The prevalence of using it, of knowing that you're employing people with disabilities, makes it intimidating when you don't have all the answers or you don't have all the information. You don't have a lot of familiarity with it. When you talk to companies that are well known for their inclusion, or they have a history of intentionally employing people with disabilities, you don't see these fears reflected. It becomes such a familiar thing for them. It becomes such a comfortable thing. They're comfortable with disability. They're comfortable with reasonable accommodations. It just is. It's how they do things all the time. This is what it became like at Walgreens, where it didn't even need to be a big point of training or communication. We got to the point where everybody knew. We all knew. It was just is. It just was part of what we did. It wasn't a big thing. It wasn't a big expense. But until your company gets there, it can be very intimidating. So just know that these kinds of unknowns are very, very at the foremost of some people's brains that you're working with for this. So put into the chat, do these fears match yours? And if not, please add yours in. I know we had one already. Thanks. Financial impact, yep. Legal implications, yep. Operational disruptions, that's interesting. Employee dissatisfaction, I love that. Let's see, another one's coming up. Okay. The one I think of is, I won't know what an employee will need, and they'll show up on day one and won't be able to participate in orientation. Or that they're, I'm sorry, the other one I get, I have this in my notes just in case nobody else brought it up, is that the disability is going to cause safety concerns. That people will be unsafe because they have a disability, or their accommodation is going to make them unsafe. And then ultimately, what I hear a lot from people is, well, if I'm giving them accommodation, it means they can't do their job. Well, no, the accommodation is so they can do their job. They worry about people being held accountable because they have an accommodation or something like that. And I understand those fears, but that's why I do webinars like this, to make sure that that's not a reasonable fear to have. And I hope that the information you get today kind of dispels that. I know none of you put that in the chat, but I just wanted to mention it because I hear it a lot. These are practical concerns and worth the time and effort to resolve. So should you have a clear and detailed process? What communication and training will need to be created? How do we figure out what a good accommodation is? How to finance, procure, and install and administer an accommodation? That's one of my faves. Should you have a separate line item for accommodation budgets? Should it be for the entire company or department by department? How to make sure it's still working and what's missing? So these are really practical concerns, and I want to hit the one about separate line items for budgets right now. So the best practices still right now are that a company as a whole in their budget holds, as an entirety, holds the, I sound like I'm saying the thing wrong again. I hope the captioning gets this right. The best practice is that a company as a whole in its entirety carries an accommodations budget line, that it isn't broken down by department, unless a particular department has experience and history with continuing accommodations. So say they have somebody who's deaf and uses an interpreter regularly, and they know the cadence of that and the costs, then it makes sense to put it into their budget separately. But it's just really challenging to just say to a business, okay, you're going to get $250 for accommodations this year in your budget line. Well, how do they know that's what they're going to need? It's better for the company as a whole. And in the beginning, when you establish your budget for the first time for accommodations, it is just a shot in the dark. Sorry. Looking at the whole scope of your company's budget, pick a percentage, and the first year, say that's your line item. And then at the end of the year, determine whether you were way over or way under, and go from there. Just know the first couple of years you are going to be off, but until you start tracking your accommodations and budgeting for this, you won't have anything to go from. And it's hard to battle the whole reasonable thing on costs. So please keep that in mind with the budget. So navigating those budget processes and policies. The best practices It's already covered the budget thing. Reasonable accommodation process is welcoming and easy for everybody. We'll get into adjustments versus accommodations in a little bit. It's a simple process, not overly bureaucratic. Easy medical information collection and safekeeping of that medical information if it's necessary. Tracking your accommodations. Accommodations are offered at every interaction of it with employees, and assistance in completing those steps is offered. Those are your best practices. So let's take a quick poll. Which best practice do you believe is most effective in your workplace today? A simple and clear process, confidentiality and sensitivity, or regular monitoring and adjustments? Where you work right now, which practice, simple and clear processes, confidentiality and sensitivity, or regular monitoring and adjustments, which do you believe is most effective in your workplace? Okay, we're at 25%. Okay, now it's coming in. 70. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. And simple and clear process is 20%. Confidentiality and sensitivity is 70%. That's good to hear. And regular monitoring and adjustments, 10%. Now, I'd like to see everybody have everything there, but I didn't give you the choice to check all of them. I'm glad that confidentiality and sensitivity is the one that's really that you guys selected the most. I'm sorry. So making the process for requesting accommodations as simple and unobtrusive as possible is really important. You can be offering multiple ways to request accommodations, such as through HR or a direct supervisor or a dedicated online portal or accommodations, different preferences, things like that. Confidentiality and sensitivity, you guys seem pretty confident about that. And the regular monitoring and adjustments, you just build that into your process. And that's how you ensure that people are getting what they need. So let's go through the elements of a good process, a good reasonable accommodation process. Develop a clear policy, making sure that it constitutes defining what constitutes as reasonable accommodation within your organization and referencing the applicable laws such as the Americans with Disabilities Act, but also if your facilities in particular states, some states actually have laws about accommodations that exceed the ADA, and your state needs to abide by those. So referencing whatever pieces of legislation that you are adhering to in this policy. And then within that policy, outline the process, basically for requesting an accommodation, including who to contact to, who's the contact for that. Sorry, who to contact when you're requesting an accommodations, and the types of documentation that might be required, and then timelines. Those are kind of your three things that I think you always want to make sure you have in their policy, besides from referencing the laws that the policy is making sure you're in compliance with. Number two, establish a dedicated team or coordinator. Definitely a best practice. Who is in charge of this? Who is the designated person for this? Not only are they designated so everybody knows who they are, but they'll develop a level of expertise because they're dedicated to it. And it's something that they're encountering more and more frequently. And so they become that subject matter expert for that. And make sure that they're trained. Sorry. And then ensuring confidentiality and privacy. Again, back to the fact that accommodations have to do with disability, and disability is health. So this is something that has to be protected. It doesn't mean it's taboo. It just means it needs to be respected and protected. That confidentiality and the privacy. It's a fine line for some people, and I think people who come sometimes. I think that sometimes people go overboard on that from a compliance perspective, and we just want to be sure that we're being respectful, that this is health information, not that we're being paranoid. So you want to implement an interactive process. I'm going to bang this drum all day long. An interactive process is so key to all of this. So implement that process. Make sure that you are having people engaged in this process, involving the dialogue that's needed between the employer and the employee to understand the limitations and potential accommodations that we could be exploring, and document all those steps involved in the interactive process. Provide training and awareness. This is cool. You could create all these policies, all these best practices, but if nobody knows what they are, they're not going to work. I do encounter people who believe that if they provide a lot of communication and training about reasonable accommodations, that they're going to have more accommodation requests. And where I differ with them is that they think that's a bad thing. I think it's a great thing. Let's have people ask for what they need to be successful. So again, that training and awareness of what an accommodation is, what the accommodation request process is, regular training and raising awareness about this stuff annually at orientation in general. When we're talking about all this, should just become something that's everybody's comfortable talking about, and it becomes everyday, typical kinds of stuff. Okay. Monitoring and reviewing accommodations. Again, you're making an investment, whether there's actual costs related to the time you put into creating the accommodation or purchasing the accommodation or whatever. This is an investment, so let's make sure it's working. Setting up a system for monitoring and reviewing accommodations regularly. Things change over time, whether it's the technology you purchased or the integration of the technology with something else that you've got going on at work, or whether it's the person's health themselves, or the job's changed. Things change all the time. We want to make sure that the solution still is optimal, or as reasonable as possible, best as reasonable possible. So monitoring, reviewing it. I encourage people to get feedback from those who are involved in the process, whether you're receiving the request or you're the requestor or somebody else involved in this process. Let's get feedback from them every once in a while. What can we do to improve this process? Process improvement. That's what we want to do. We want to make sure things are better for people. Maybe there's a step in the process that really isn't serving anybody. So let's be able to encourage that feedback. And also, of course, you're going to have feedback for if an accommodation is denied, that appeal process, that sort of thing. You do need to have those sorts of loops also into your processes. Number 8, document and communicate. Document. You'll hear me say that all the time. Document and communicate about the process, about where people are in the process, the decisions being made in the process. This is all incredibly important. Number 9, being flexible and creative. I think that so many people don't understand what accommodations could be, and so they try to, kind of stay in a very narrow lane. Okay, it means it's captioning for a video, or it means it's a sign language interpreter, or it means a wheelchair ramp. No, it's you can be very creative and flexible about accommodations. That's the beauty of them, is how flexible and creative you get with them to make sure they work. Again, this is about an individual in an individual situation, and so it should be individualized. It should be creative and innovative. So be flexible and creative with these things. And then leverage your external resources. Again, I'll be talking about examples later on, and I'll be talking about the resources that are available, but I'll mention them right now. You can get technical assistance from technical assistance centers for the Americans with Disabilities Act. I don't know what they're really called right now, but they change about every 5 years. They're regional centers around the U.S. There used to be a Great Lakes one. I don't know where they're all located now. It used to be one in Atlanta. So the country was divided into 10 regions, and each one of them had a technical assistance Americans with Disabilities Center. You'll find them if you just Google that. But also, the ultimate resource for accommodations is the Job Accommodation Network, which we call JAN, or JAN for short. So JAN is federally funded group who have been doing this for, I think, 20 years now, if not longer, focused solely on accommodations. Companies who have hired somebody with a disability, needing an accommodation, what accommodation worked, how did they get that accommodation put into place? This is your wealth of experience and knowledge. This is your knowledge base, is JAN, the Job Accommodation Network. So please leverage those resources. And if you need, get your legal people involved as well. Get those leverage external resources. So who should be involved in this process? So we talked about what what the process should include, who should be involved. There's debate about whether you want a manager, the direct manager, or HR involved in the accommodation process. I think everybody should be involved. That manager is usually where the initial communication about an accommodation comes out of. They have to initiate open communication. Somebody is communicating to start this out, and it usually goes through that manager. So be aware of that, that if you're keeping managers out of this process, they're usually the open door. So maybe that's why you don't see accommodations, because you think they have to come to HR automatically. Usually they come through managers. The managers understand the employee's role and their needs better than HR does. They should and will be, and I hope are collaborating with HR. So that's why managers should be involved. They're collaborators to this. They're the ones typically implementing the accommodations, setting them up, making sure that they are working within the operations of the facility or the workplace. They're monitoring and adjusting accommodations. Typically, they're the ones doing that because they're the ones in contact with the employee about how things are going with their performance. And they're promoting team adaptability and inclusivity when they're involved in accommodations. So again, you want managers to be involved in them, but you also need HR. HR provides the guidance on legal compliance. They're offering the resources for accommodation options. They've seen this in lots of different realms. They've got a lot of professional associations that they can pull resources from as well, ideas for what would be a good accommodation. They facilitate the interactive process. They understand what's supposed to happen. They know what needs to happen from a compliance perspective and in that process. And they can also help just the conversation itself. HR is really good with communication, facilitating good communication, helping people have effective communication. So you want HR in there. They maintain the documentation most of the time. That's great. Or they assist the managers in ensuring that documentation is maintained. They provide the training and awareness on the process. So again, we want them involved, and they monitor the compliance and effectiveness as well. So again, this is your team that should be involved in the interactive process. But who else? The employee, of course, the employee. You want, there could be other individuals involved, whether the employee has assistance. I know a lot of you are job developers or job coaches in this webinar. So that assistance, people with disabilities get assistance sometimes. And so you could be involving those people into the process of determining what's an appropriate accommodation. You could be engaging with an accommodation specialist. Some of the employee services programs that are out there now, they have folks who are accommodation specialists. They've got the expertise across multiple companies or multiple industries. So those might be people to engage in here as well. If you've got a network or an affinity group, a disability-based or focused network or affinity group, ERG sometimes they're called, what about engaging them? Get their ideas on how to create something that's going to be effective, or about the process overall. And there's other subject matter experts you could be involving. IT, if there's something that involves technology, you want your IT, your infrastructure for, what does IT stand for again? Technology, information technology, sorry. You want your information technology folks engaged in this process as well, especially if this involves technology. I'll tell you a quick story about that. We had an intern who was deaf and needed to participate in a lot of conference calls. At the time, conference calls were mostly by phone. This is before Teams was a thing. Video calls were a thing, really. But so she couldn't hear the phone call, and we just transferred over to a VIOP, voice over internet protocol standard. And so we wanted to engage with video interpreters. And that system existed at the time as a service. And so you needed to have the way for the video to connect to the phone. And the only way to do that was through the phone being an internet VoIP. That I needed IT to help us figure out, how do we take this service that comes in through the phone cord and runs through things so that this woman can, do her job and be involved in conference calls that are making decisions or relaying information or whatever. It took us 6 months to get everybody involved because we had to buy it. We needed procurement. We needed IT. It was, excuse my language, it was a shit show. From that point forward, I realized how important it was to have these people up front engaged in things, just knowing that you are the person we're going to call if we need help with an accommodation that's related to IT or to the building itself, or something where safety is engaged, operations ergonomics, procurement. All of those entities within the company needed to be informed of what accommodations were, why we did them. They had to be included in the training, and that they were part of the team that was going to help us decide what was reasonable and what would accommodate somebody's barriers. So let's talk about the interactive process for just a second. I could have this training completely focused just on the interactive process and give you lots of scenarios of good interactive processes and those that are a little faulty. But Jan does a great job, has done a great job in the last 10 years of recording scenarios, hiring actors to do scenarios that were designed by the disability community and the business community together. Some of these are real scenarios. People's names were changed to protect the innocent. But so take a screenshot of this link, or just when you're on YouTube, search for Jan, Jan. You can throw the word accommodation in there, interactive process. They've got a whole bunch of videos, and they're really well done to demonstrate what the interactive process involves and how it goes well and how it doesn't go well. Again, the interactive process is the conversation between the person who needs the accommodation and HR, and typically managers as well, and some others that help engage and make sure this process moves forward well. So I'm not going to cover the interactive process much more than that. I want you to go to that YouTube channel and just watch a couple of their videos. They do a really, really nice job, much better job than I can try to do in a webinar. So, quick poll. Do you think employers should require medical information for applicants who are requesting accommodations? It's a very specific question, but it's something that I've run into a few times recently, that an employer is requiring medical information for an applicant to ask for an accommodation. So yes, always, yes, sometimes, or never. Do you think that employers should require medical information for applicants? You guys are quick. 89, 94%. Okay, I'm going to close the poll. So 28% of you say yes, always. 64% say yes, sometimes. And 8% say never. I'm more in the never camp, but it's hard to be an extreme when we're talking about accommodations, since there's supposed to be a compromise or a collaboration. So I'm going to go with the camp that says yes, sometimes. I think there are definitely situations where medical information is not needed for an accommodation to happen for an applicant, especially for an applicant. In fact, my opinion is that it shouldn't be for an applicant unless there is a significant financial hardship or investment by the business. Otherwise, what they're an applicant and you're going to ask for medical information. Do you even have the systems to take that information and keep it? So anyway, off my soapbox for that one. In the idea of should medical information be required, the world for people with disabilities has not always been supportive. The world, as people with disabilities experience it, has not always been supportive. Some of that recent history, so even if your company is uber inclusive, some of that recent history is being experienced by the folks that you're employing. And so they've got sort of negative connotations already. Do not assume that the new employee has had good experiences when disclosing or asking for accommodations in their past, even if you are a super inclusive company. So just know that requests for medical information are very touchy topics. And you may want to become flexible on it, depending on the scenario. Use your best judgment. Don't be so hard compliance-based that everybody has to do it. That's my opinion. In my opinion, employers should not ask for verifying medical information unless the accommodation to the hiring process requires a significant financial investment. I already said that out loud, but it's on my slide. this is an applicant applying for a job and you want to put a barrier there? Do you have that many applicants that you don't need to be catering to all of your applicants? Make the process easier. Just keep that in mind. Okay. Is training enough for educating employees and managers? That's a good question to ask yourself. Is training enough? Is the training I've created good enough? And do I provide it enough? Providing training on disability awareness and the importance of accommodations for all employees with specific in-depth training for managers and HR personnel is something I encourage you to participate in. Training on disability awareness and the importance of accommodations for everybody, and then some more in-depth training for managers and HR personnel, and I would want that to be regular. Ensure that everyone understands the legal rights of employees to request accommodations and the benefits of accommodations to both employees and the organization. If all you're talking about is the cost and the process, and you're not talking about the benefits, you're really swinging people's perspective about them. So, other best practices: promote an inclusive culture. Geez, we could do a year's worth of webinars just about that. I think I have. So let's make sure that we're promoting an inclusive culture. That means including people with disabilities, not just adding them on top. Use your resources like Jan. Communicate the process clearly and provide examples of what accommodations are, what they look like. And that's such an obscure concept. And at the end of this webinar, I am going to just stuff you full of examples. So when you're talking about accommodations, you can give examples if you don't have any personal ones of your own that you've recently experienced. Emphasize confidentiality, of course. Follow up with employees to ensure that those accommodations are effective and adjust them as needed. This is an ongoing thing. This is a living thing. It should not be considered, one and done. Encourage feedback and create a way for employees to provide it anonymously, if that's what they prefer. Lead by example. What do I mean by that? I think that the companies who have the best practices in accommodations have leaders who have disabilities and have disclosed them and talk about the accommodations that they use to be successful. Get your leaders to be examples. If a leader isn't willing to disclose their disability or talk about their accommodations, it says a lot about your inclusive culture or your lack of an inclusive culture, because the statistics bear out. Your leaders have them. There are so many corporate leaders who have disabilities and talk about them. We know that people at that level can be successful with their disabilities, in case that was your perception. Just want to knock that one out of the park right now. So lead by example by getting your leaders to be examples and to talk about it, normalize it, make it just part of everyday topics. Address and prevent retaliation. This is really important. It's crucial, and it is a legal compliance piece. Just because somebody asks for an accommodation does not mean that they can be fired. There is no retaliation available for that. And this is where sometimes the relationship between the employee and the manager can be pretty contentious, because productivity hasn't been what it's supposed to be. Performance hasn't been great. So there's already this tension there. And so you want to help the manager ensure that there isn't going to be retaliation when the person finally does ask for their accommodation and things get better, and the manager's sitting there going, why didn't you ask for this before? We're going to deal with that. Have our emotional maturity to say, okay, they just didn't know enough yet. Now they're here. We're all excited about it. So addressing and preventing retaliation is a key to being successful with this. And determine what autonomy managers can have in the request accommodation process. Somebody asks for a pencil. Are you going to put that into an accommodation process? You want to document it, but are you going to send it through this process? That's I think that's something that businesses need to get good at. And it's something that's going to have to evolve. In the beginning, you want to be pretty hardcore about your process and make sure people understand how to go through it and get enough examples and experience under their belts to better understand how it flows in with everything that they do. But eventually, you're going to want to decide how much autonomy your managers can have to decide whether or not they're just going to approve something without really sending it through the whole interactive process. They've had a conversation with the manager, with the employee. It all seems reasonable. It makes sense. It isn't going to cost anything. Yeah, go do that. And then just send a note to HR and say, just want you to know, I've approved this already. Please put it into the documentation system. And then lean into the interactive process. So again, I just talked about bypassing the interactive process, but when you need an interactive process, which is especially in the beginning of implementing these kinds of things, and when you're getting to know a new employee and those sorts of things, or a new manager, the interactive process is a conversation. It's a conversation. It's a big conversation between all the parties involved to determine if this solution is going to make sense and to generate other ideas for solutions and kind of try them on, evaluate them. What's going to make the most sense for everybody involved? What's going to make people as successful as possible? Okay, I think I've covered that. What are the best practices for applicants and candidates? So I touched on this a little bit when we were talking about medical information for applicants and candidates. Do you want to collect that? So in recruiting, I think it's really important that your ATS, your applicant tracking system, your recruiting and career websites should all have prominent information about the process for requesting accommodations and promote the company's enthusiasm to ensure success for applicants, for candidates, people applying for the jobs. Have your career websites and social medias that should include employees talking freely and enthusiastically about their experience requesting and receiving accommodations that they needed. When you look at the leaders of inclusive work environments, the companies that do that, they, first of all, in their career websites, they have lots of employees talking about how much they love their jobs, how much they love working for those companies. And within those collections of videos are several where the employees saying, and I got a disability and this is what it was like to get an accommodation, blah, 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 blah. It's just part of the story. It's not the whole story. It's part of the story. Just bring that in. Make sure that you've got that as soon as you've got some examples of it to use. Whomever is scheduling interviews should ask every single candidate if they will or might need an accommodation for the interview. It should not be whether that person doing the scheduling knows that this person has an accommodation or suspects that knows that the person has a disability or suspects that the person has a disability and therefore says, hey, if you're going to need accommodations, let me know. No. You want that person to ask every single candidate, hey, are you going to need anything to be successful? You're going to need an accommodation? I'm setting up your interview. This is great. You got the time, the date. You're going to need an accommodation? Okay, I'll make sure that request gets taken care of. Then you also want to make sure that person knows what to do when somebody does request for an accommodation. Who in your company sets these things up, schedules interpreters, or makes arrangements for testing exceptions, or whatever it is. Accommodations, not exceptions. So make sure that person offers them all the time and knows what to do when a candidate says, oh yeah, I'm going to need something. Encourage various interview formats, in person, on the phone, in video, all sorts of those sorts of things. Even with interviews where instead of in a room, you're going to take them around to where the workplace is and show them, this is what the job looks like. This is what the workplace looks like. Is this something you think you can do? Something you want to be? Someplace you want to be? And I could go in all day long about interviews. That's a different webinar. And ensure that your ATS creates multiple paths to employment for everybody, but especially for people with disabilities. Is there temp to perm options? Is there internships? Are there apprenticeships? Things like that. And then in job fairs. Job fairs and all other recruitment related events and activities need to be inclusive and accessible. And this is tough because not all job fairs are accessible. Most of them try to be inclusive and miss on the accessibility part. But anyway, but also remember that job fairs require a certain skill set and familiarity and comfort. And so people who don't come to job fairs, if that's the only way to get a job is through a job fair, you're never going to get those candidates. And that's a negative to you, not on them. There are certain disabilities that really prevent people from being able to participate in job fairs, no matter how accessible they are. It's still a noisy, busy environment with restricted space, that's availability for moving around, lack of privacy, etc. So virtual job fairs are great. They offer a lot of opportunities for people with disabilities. So if you're going to do an in-person job fair, consider doing a virtual one as well. Okay, that's it. Onboarding. Accommodations are offered at every interaction. I just said that. and assistance in completing steps is offered. I can't tell you how many times people have gotten lost in an application. I've gotten lost in helping somebody fill out an application. I've gotten lost in filling out applications myself. That's tough process. It'd be nice if you guys had a tour guide, somebody who's there to just help people get through that process, whether it's because their disability, they can't complete the steps because of whatever, the way things are framed or the technology or whatever, or if it's just simply they just don't understand the questions or the process. What am I supposed to do next? Let's have some tour guides. I think that would be a great way to really promote the accessibility and ensure that people who need accommodations are going to be able to get them. So your employer's responsibilities. It is impossible for an applicant to request an accommodation if they do not know everything about the hiring process. So when we're talking about applicants, if they aren't aware of the entire hiring process, you cannot say, oh, hey, how come you didn't tell me that you needed an accommodation for that? They didn't know what it was. So a good practice is to have in your applicant tracking system and in your career websites and in any sorts of recruitment materials or events, you explain what is the process to get a job here. This is how many questions you're going to get, and this is what the application looks like. This is what we're going to be asking you in the interview. You're going to have to go through a drug screen. You're going to have to go through a criminal background check, all these things. Just let them know what that process is. It doesn't need to be a secret. I don't know why people keep that a secret. Oh, we can't let them know the questions ahead of time. Why not? What's so great about those questions that's preventing people from being successful or preventing you from being successful in interviewing them if they know the questions ahead of time? Let's just share everything. What is the point of the secrecy? Unless the job requirements are that they are able to respond to questions they're not anticipating. So maybe if they're in customer service, it does make sense to keep those questions private. But for most jobs, I don't know why keeping the interview questions is so sacred. And you want to pop that question on somebody and see how they respond. That's not really about them, their ability to do the job. That's about you as an interviewer being able to scare the crap out of people. I know that I'm pretty much alone in my opinion about that, but that's my point. With accommodations, you don't expect that somebody's going to be able to ask for an accommodation if they don't know everything about the process. And even then, they may not know until they get there. Don't have this assumption that people should be asking for accommodations beforehand. We want them to be able to do that. We want to give them as much information as possible, but they may not know until they get there. The employer is responsible for openly and specifically explaining the hiring process and welcoming questions from candidates. Help them understand it all. Until it's done, there's no expectation the candidate can request an accommodation. And then the employer is responsible for ensuring that all candidates are aware of the process and the timeline for that accommodation request. Those are your responsibilities as the employer. Please take them seriously. So, have you ever received a request for an accommodation? I realize that may not be an applicable question for everybody, but I know we got a lot of HR folks, managers. If you ever had anybody that you supervised, have you ever received a request for an accommodation? Yes, no, or I don't know. You can say no if you've never had anybody report to you. Okay, let's try to fill in. 80%, 90%. Okay, all right, closing the poll. All right, so we got 52% saying yes. Awesome. Got 46% saying no. Thank you. And I love the 2% that said they don't know. So the majority of you have received a request for an accommodation. That's awesome. I love that. So tell me, what was the experience like? I don't need the whole story, but what accommodation requests did you receive? What words were used when they asked for the accommodation, or did they fill out a form? Was this a proactive or a reactive request? Reactive is when they're like getting into a performance improvement conversation and saying, oh, by the way, I have a disability, I need this accommodation. Was there a formal process that you had to follow? Were you intimidated or were you confident? And so tell me more. I shared the experience of trying to find, I knew it took a while for me to find the accommodation that was going to be a good fit for or work with the intern who was deaf and needed that video interpreting service. It took us a while to find that was an option and that it would probably work. But then the process of going through IT and procurement and getting this set up, and there was I don't remember the details of this, and this was a while ago, so maybe technology isn't like this anymore, but there was a port that needed a protocol, and they needed to open that port. I don't know what that means, but they had to open a port for this interpreter service to be able to come through. I'm envisioning it like, through a wire um, to the device, and then have that connected to the phone call where the voice from the person she was talking to would need to be interpreted. And then again, what she's signing, that the interpreter then can voice what she's saying to the person on the call or the people in the call. That technology piece of it was really hard. It took forever. And so I have a lot of empathy for everybody involved in accommodations. So, okay. Let's see. Words were used. This is all over the place in the chat. I'm sorry. So request for accommodation. It was reactive. The person was about to get fired. I was pretty angry. Thank you for admitting that, for owning that. It's tough when you're ready to let them go because you've had to put up with a non-performer or someone with lack of performance for so long, and now it's like, oh, well, maybe now is the solution. Let me get there. Performance, created the accommodation, didn't make a difference, had to let them go. Yep, that's not atypical. Followed the formal process, loved it. I'm sorry, I didn't understand. A typo in there. Okay. Anybody intimidated by the process? I know when you said you loved the process. Didn't know what I was doing. I love that. Thank you. Yes. Didn't know what you were doing. A lot of us feel that way. Called Jan. Oh, thank you. Thank you for reinforcing that Jan's such a good resource. Okay. All right. Let's move forward, but thank you. So the realities and the context for the requester. Okay, so that was all about the business. Let's talk about the requestor, the person with a disability who needs an accommodation. First, I want to preface everything on this section by saying this is a training on reasonable accommodation. This is not a training on disclosure. But to request a reasonable accommodation, you have to disclose your disability. So I am not going to touch that topic. We have another webinar about that. But just know these things are intertwined. And so, again, I know one of you brought it up in the chat, and I kind of ignored it because we're not going to talk about disclosure today, but we'll bring it up in another webinar. So here's a quick poll. Do you know how to request an accommodation in your workplace? Now, we already had a whole bunch of you say that you've received accommodations, so I'm assuming that you do know, but is it yes, clearly you know how to do it, somewhat, or no, I'm unsure? Oh, okay, I can close the poll. You're done. Sorry, I was distracted. We've got 22% of you saying yes, clearly, 70% saying somewhat. That's good. I knew you were claiming to be experts. I like it. So, but there's 22%, and 8% no, I am unsure. And in the chat it says, I know where to look and I know who to ask. That's awesome. Yes. Okay. So this is a very wordy slide, and I apologize for that, but I'm going to read it to you. How does one request an accommodation? And I took this from the internet. The process for requesting a reasonable accommodation varies depending on the employer's policies. Generally, an employee or job applicant can request an accommodation by letting their employer know what they need, an adjustment or change at work due to a medical condition. This request can be made verbally or in writing, and the employee does not need to mention the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, or use the phrase reasonable accommodation. It's beneficial for the request to be as specific as possible about the needed accommodation and how it will assist the employee in performing their job duties. Employers may also require the employee to provide documentation from a healthcare provider to substantiate the disability and the need for an accommodation. And then the interactive process begins. I actually got that from AI. I wanted to consolidate all of the information out there about people who define this. But that's how you get an accommodation. You say, hey, I got an issue. I need a solution. I got a disability, and let's go. That's my plain language version of it. From the employee's perspective, so again, focusing on this section on the employee, keep in mind, reasonable accommodations are first and foremost reasonable in the eyes of the employer. That's what all the courts are covering. So reasonable in your mind as the requester may be different than your company. As the requester, your obligations is to identify the barriers and be an active participant at looking at possible solutions, brainstorming ideas, listening to the constraints defined by your employer, engage if the accommodation is effective. So whatever decision you guys have come to, is it effective? And provide feedback if it needs to be adjusted. Those are your obligations. Identify the barrier, be an active participant, brainstorm ideas, listen to constraints, gauge if the accommodation that is decided is effective, and provide feedback if it needs to be adjusted. Those are your obligations. I think it's really important that everybody with a disability or anybody who's going to request an accommodation understands. It's not just, I need this, and you walk away. There's a lot of this that you're involved in, and it should be. This is about you being successful. Why would you not want these things? Remember that the accommodation you're looking for, or the accommodation that's eventually determined, may not be ideal. It may not be what you were asking for. There's a great metaphor that a Yugo does what a Cadillac will do. So you can't get the Cadillac. It's a pretty car. It's really expensive. A Yugo, I don't even know if Yugos are still on the road. It might be showing my age there, but it was a very basic car, very inexpensive car, but it got you where you needed to go. So it doesn't have to be ideal. It doesn't have to be pretty, but it needs to be effective. And I think one thing to keep in mind is that you may have in mind what you think the accommodation should be. And if they have a different idea, then what should you do? And I'm not going to tell you what you should do. I am going to say that if the company says, here's what we're offering you as an accommodation, we think this will be effective, we think this will work. And if you don't think it will be, and you say, nope, I reject that, that's not it, they can then deem that you're not qualified for the job. That's a harsh idea, but it's a reality. So you're better off, in my opinion, when you request an accommodation and they're offering you something that you don't think is going to be as effective, give it a try. And give it a real try, real efforts. It's about your mindset. Okay, I think this will work. I think I can make this work. I think I can figure out how this works. Try it out. And the thing is that even if it doesn't end up being the most effective, what you'll learn is what will be effective. You'll be able to show, this worked, this part of this worked, but this part, really wasn't a good fit. Let's continue to have the conversation, continue that interactive process to see what will work. Okay. Next poll. Do you believe employees are well informed about their role in the accommodation request process that I just outlined? This whole active process that they need to be. Do you think that employees are well informed about this? Yes, definitely, somewhat informed, or no, not at all. Oh, you guys are being quick. Okay. So yes, definitely is 22%. Somewhat informed is 70%, or no, not at all is 8%. I love your 8%. Whoever's answering those questions consistently, I think you're the same person, same two people every time. But do you believe your job seekers? So this is specifically to the people who help people with disabilities find jobs now. So the rest of you, just bear with me for a second. Do you believe your job seekers are well informed about their role in the accommodation request process? Yes, definitely, somewhat informed, or no, not at all. I don't know what percentage to go through here. Okay, so yeah, okay. So yes, definitely 8%, somewhat informed 12%, no, not at all 80%. Okay, you guys have a job to do. As the person who assists another person with a disability in finding a job, your job is also to make sure that they understand the reasonable accommodation process, that they learn it, and you're able to help them find the information on the website when they're applying. That's part of your job. So I appreciate your responses. I hope that you're now going to consider this important. and make sure that you add it to your services. So, okay. Employees' responsibility. So not just the applicant, but the employees, to identify the barrier, either in advance or as soon as you're realizing you're having a barrier, to identify it. The longer you wait, the more it would create the impression that you're not sincere about your responsibilities as an active participant in this process. So make people aware. Hey, this doesn't seem to be working. I don't know if it's my disability or not, but I got a problem here. I'm struggling. I'm not being as successful as I think I can be in this. Be aware of and follow that process. Notify whoever is responsible. Start with your manager and make HR aware that you would like to enter the interactive process. Again, you don't have to use those words, but make sure you're entering it. I want to be in the process of trying to figure out what's the answer here. Then be an active participant in that process, the interactive process. Give as much detail about the barrier and actively suggest solutions. Keep an open mind and listen to any constraints the employer is discussing in relation to your request, and be creative. Think about something else. And then when it's decided, monitor your health, the barriers that are experienced, and the efficacy of the accommodation. Do so in a collaborative way. Don't come back every week and report out on it. Set up, an agreed schedule, like maybe annually or after the first accommodation, maybe 90 days in, just a quick check. Okay, this doesn't seem to be working, or this does seem to be working, especially if it doesn't seem to be working. Keep your manager more in loop than HR, but keep speaking to the department that's responsible for accommodations and setting up regular time to check in with them, at least annually. Best practice, please. Please take this on. Okay. So here's the top 10 reasons. This is actually for everybody, in case some of you have stepped away because you weren't interested in what the employees needed to do. Top 10 reasons why employees may hesitate to ask for accommodations. I know this was a long webinar, I apologize, but this is important stuff. Number one reason, fear of discrimination or stigma about their disability and the fact that they have a disability. Concerns about their job security. If I ask for an accommodation, am I going to lose my job? Again, that's why it's so important early on in the process, building the process for employers, make sure that they've got active ways to prevent retaliation. Lack of awareness. That is definitely a reason. People don't know that they have an accommodation, that need accommodation. They don't know they have a disability. They don't know that what the process is. Lack of awareness of all of it. Let's get people more aware. Misunderstandings about the process. I don't understand what the process is. I don't know how to use it. Worrying about burdening the employer. This is so sweet. As an employee, I'm worried about asking for something from my employer. Well, if you don't ask for it, you're not going to be able to serve them as well. So think about this as a two-way street for benefits here. Desire for privacy. I get that. But if you want to be successful in your work, sometimes you have to share things and be open about them. You can be very protective about your health, but if your health is preventing you from being successful, you want to be able to talk about it in a safe way. And this is confidential and private. The information is going to be kept private. They have to do that. They're actually required by law to keep that private. So trust that and move forward. Past negative experiences. If you have applied for a job somewhere else or asked for an accommodation somewhere else and it's not been a good experience, don't assume that that's what's going to happen in your current place of employment. So those past negative experiences don't necessarily designate what your life's going to be like now in this experience. Cultural and social factors. So I think this is really important, something we're not really hitting on in this webinar, but there are a lot of cultural factors related to disability. Different cultures manage people with disabilities within their culture differently. So especially the Hispanic culture and the Asian culture, there's this strong familial responsibility within it for people with disabilities. A lot of people with disabilities don't do anything. Their family does it all for them, takes care of them and their needs. So if somebody's been raised in that sort of culture, they may have challenges asking for things. They're used to their family taking care of it for them. So just know that those factors might be a reason why somebody's hesitant to ask for their accommodation. Fear of change. I think that's the least likely, but that is something people have said. I'm afraid about the changes that'll happen with that accommodation. And the perceived lack of support, which I think is a very realistic reason to have hesitation. If I ask for an accommodation, how is that going to be received? So again, communication and clarity can really help individuals move forward. So let's talk about empathy and advocacy for everyone involved. Empathy and advocacy for the business. don't mean to make this sound like there's two sides against each other, but let's look at it from the business perspective first. Why is there angst about accommodations? Because it's a legal term, and any and all legal terms make everybody squirm. I didn't mean to make that a rhyme, except perhaps a very experienced disability lawyer. And if any of you are on here, great. We need you as well to help us all feel better about this. Accommodations imply that you have to spend money. That's the implication. Doesn't mean it's true, but that's what people think it implies. You have to spend money. And almost everyone believes that they have to figure it out and they have no clue how or where to start. Again, it's just very intimidating thinking that somehow as the employer, you have to come up with the answers. And so as much as I do this training for folks with disabilities to understand this stuff, I also want you to understand that we've got a lot of empathy for you about this, but I want you to cut it out. You do not need to come up with these answers. You need to be a part of the group that comes up with the answers. Okay, so what else we got? Helping employers overcome this angst is making sure you're following the company's process. So if you're in charge of that process, make sure people get training on it. Don't try to anticipate the accommodation. I just was talking about this. The employee is the one who understands the barrier the best. And might have really great ideas on what to work. You don't have to solve this problem for them. You need to work with them to come up with the solution. And if the employee acts like you should have the answer, then you need to guys just work further on having a good dialogue and an interactive process. Leverage the Job Accommodation Network. I'm going to beat that drum all day long. Job Accommodation Network, JAN. Call them. Go to their website. Use it. And set up a schedule to check in and make sure that accommodations are still working. That is a great way to overcome your angst. You don't have to worry about people slipping through the cracks. Empathy and advocacy for the requestor. So the person asking for it, their angst is because this is a legal term, and all legal terms make everybody squirm unless you're an experienced disability lawyer. Accommodations imply that you have to expose a weakness. And almost everyone believes that you have to figure it out and have no clue how or where to start. Does that sound familiar? It seems the angst is shared by the requester and by the business. So, how do we help the requesters overcome their angst? We try to be as concrete and fact-based as possible. Just because you're asking for an accommodation does not mean you can't do your job or that you're lesser in any way. If you've a strained relationship with your manager, build a relationship with someone else within the company who can help. Leverage the Job Accommodation Network. That is actually as much for you as it is for the employer. You need ideas to find ways to solve the barriers you're experiencing? Go to the Job Accommodation Network. They've got uber information in there about the disability type, the barrier it experienced, and the type of job or the responsibility within the job where the struggle is. So just tons of resources. 2 decades of lessons learned, experiences, successes documented in there. Go to askjan.org and set up a schedule to check in and make sure that your accommodation is still working. This goes on both sides. Okay, accommodations and productivity. So the case against requiring disclosure, this is Rich Donovan's take on things. He is the CEO and the founder of Return on Disability, which is a stock index that measures the performance of companies that are disability inclusive through their activities, not just through what they're talking about, but what they're doing to be more disability inclusive. They're rated in this stock index. And so Rich does a ton of research. And just so you know, he is Canadian and his business is based in Canada where they use the word adjustments. So some of this is a little bit, might be confusing for the people from the US, but increased productivity by non-people with disabilities is the argument for not requiring disclosure. If you only make accommodations available to people who have disclosed disability, then you got a whole bunch of your workforce who, for whatever reason, don't think that applies to them. It could be because they don't know that they have a disability, or they don't have the documentation about their disability, but they know they have it. The disability is causing a barrier. Your worker is experiencing a barrier. Why would we not want to solve that, whether or not it's caused by a documentable or a disability that somehow fits into this particular definition? Why wouldn't you just want everybody to have access to what they need to be successful? That is Rich's point. And why disclosure should not be a requirement of disability. And he's got a lot of examples of companies that don't require that medical definition, that medical documentation. They may just talk about what's the barrier you're experiencing, and they document that. He says that untying productivity adjustments, which are also accommodations, from conversations of disability normalizes such adjustments as an ordinary part of work culture. This normalization helps to mitigate feeling by people with disabilities of being viewed as different from their coworkers, and it doesn't out them, with air quotes around the word out, when they receive an adjustment, and it creates more productive and engaged workforce. In other words, everybody's getting something to help them be successful. So just because you have something different doesn't mean you have a disability. It maintains that cloak of anonymity that a lot of people with disabilities are seeking. So I think it's an interesting point. I think it's definitely something that's debatable, and I love being involved in those conversations. So let's talk about adjustments versus accommodations from the U.S. perspective. So I know plenty of managers who have allowed their employees to do something different from the way the job or the system is structured. And I'll use a very cliche example, the soccer mom who wants, or dad, soccer parent, who wants to go to a game because their kid is in a tournament. And so they want to leave work early, or because they have regular things with their kids every Tuesday at 4:30, so they need to leave work a little early. They'll come in early, but that's different versus the person who's going through chemo and needs to go to doctor's appointments. It's the same change to the way things are done. It's about adjusting somebody's work schedule. So do we need to have a doctor's note for that? I think that managers need to have this autonomy to decide if their worker needs something and is asking for something, that they're going to decide if they can get it. What we need to eliminate is managers that do that in an indiscriminate way, meaning that they're not applying that kind of idea of supporting everybody to everybody, and they're just promoting it to specific people. And that really garners that idea of favoritism. So accommodations versus adjustments. Where do you draw the line? Now, I think if somebody needs to document and provide medical information to prove that they have a disability to get the accommodation, that's obviously an accommodation. But there are so many things that are in this spectrum in between, so many invisible accommodations that we can make for people, adjusting a schedule, or providing them with notes, or putting up agendas before a meeting starts. A lot of these things are best practices, not necessarily accommodations. They're ways to make people more productive, individualized. So let's think about that. I don't know the answer, but it's a very interesting conversation to have. I think that companies are more compliance-based. Definitely draw a hard line in there and just say, hey, if there's a disability involved, it's an accommodation, and if it's not, somehow you're making things better for other employees. And that really forces that disclosure conversation that Rich was talking about in the last slide. So accommodations and adjustments, there isn't a hard line between them. And somebody who has a disability and hasn't disclosed it but asks for an adjustment that makes things easier for them at work or makes them more successful at work, is that an accommodation? They have a disability, but they didn't tell the company. I don't know. Okay. How to help applicants and candidates. The individual making the job offer can share information about the company's desire to facilitate a smooth transition. Again, back to the idea of when we're talking about applicants, if they understand everything about the job that they're accepting, I'm sorry, this candidate's not applicants, that they can make a good decision about asking for accommodations up front, so things can be put forward earlier. But it doesn't mean that they're being manipulative or catching you off guard if they don't ask until then. Ensuring that those who are responsible for implementing onboarding have sufficient training about accommodation processes. People who are setting up those new employee workstations, do they know what somebody's going to need, or are they prepared if somebody asks for a specific piece of equipment or software to be loaded onto their workstation before they get there? Those who provide access to the facility and the parking, do they know if somebody's going to need an accommodation? Is that a communication channel set up? And are they surprised by this kind of thing, or are they trained well enough? Okay, sure, no problem. That's their kind of reaction that they have. Who's responsible for making sure requested accommodations are in place? Who has decided? I'm sorry, who has been determined, delegated to that responsibility? That person needs to know, and they need to make sure they can follow through on all of this stuff and make sure it happens. Who will make sure the accommodation is placed for the individual's first day of work? I am hoping it is this person who's in charge of accommodations in general, but if you have a big enough place and you can divide it up against a team, just make sure nothing gets falling through the cracks. And make sure new hires know that they can and should ask for an accommodation as soon as they know they need it. Okay. Not everyone knows they need an accommodation before starting their job. I think I've hammered this one enough. I don't need to be going on it. Some simple things you can do to ensure your company is inclusive of employees with invisible disabilities. I just want to hit invisible disabilities for a bit. Ensure that you have solid policies to manage accommodation requests and ensure that that there is a neutral appeals process, meaning there's no implications of anything. I don't like the decision that's made, and we're going to an appeal process. It's not negative in any way for either side of it. And don't assume that you only need this in place for lower level employees. This should be something that you're talking about to all levels of employees, including executives. This is what an accommodation process looks like. This is how you ask for one. Do you know what an accommodation is? Just want to make sure you know in case you need to ask for one. Here's your process. Here's everything you need to know. This shouldn't be something just for managers or the people down from them. It should be everybody understands the accommodation process. Okay, let's talk about the benefits. This is a pretty quick one. Accommodation statistics. About 10% of people with disabilities need an accommodation. Of those accommodations, 59% are free. 36% have one-time costs with an average of less than $500. And 4% have recurring costs. This is data from the Job Accommodation Network. Really excited about it because it disproves the idea that because we're talking about accommodations, we're talking about costs and budgets. Let's talk about creativity for a second. So I think that one of the benefits of accommodation is the creativity that it creates. This is truly problem solving and troubleshooting, and it's looking at things differently so that we can get there. It's creativity that comes from solution creation is awesome. We're talking about productivity. That's why reasonable accommodations are good. We want people to be performing in their jobs. Many reasonable accommodations go on to improve everyone's lives, and I'll give you examples of that when we get to the next section of this. And it's innovation. We're looking at things differently. Again, creativity, solutions, productivity. This is all good things that companies thrive on. What do you think is the biggest challenge in implementing reasonable accommodations? This is a poll question, in case you stepped away from your screen. Is it A, budget constraints, B, operational demands, C, compliance and legal fears, D, lack of awareness or expertise, or E, none of the above? I'll ask the question one more time. What do you think is the biggest challenge in implementing reasonable accommodations? Okay, 70%, 82%. Okay, I'm closing the poll. All right. So, budget constraints, 25%. Operational demands, 7%. Compliance and legal fears, 30%. That's pretty reasonable. Lack of awareness or expertise, 15%. And 23% say it's none of the above. I don't know the answer, but I am very curious, or I'm very happy that you guys gave me your opinion. Um, I don't know if budget constraints are really the biggest challenge implementing reasonable accommodations. I think that sometimes each of these answers applies. I'm not sure there's a universal reason for why they can be so challenging. So, okay, let's talk about creativity and solutions. We're about to get to examples. So if anybody's been waiting for examples, they are coming up right after the next slide. Inclusive design. So I just want to hit this first. When we're talking about inclusive design, how do we make sure that we don't need accommodations, that everybody can access and be successful in every environment? It's using principles of inclusive design. And according to the Center for Inclusive Design, the relative cost of retrofitting a product or a service to become inclusive will increase significantly over time and can reach up to 10,000 times the cost of making it inclusively by design in the first place. So let's just keep that in mind. We want to make things inclusive from the beginning and not try to retrofit them in the end. Same with accommodations. We want to try to have everything work for everybody. And if we have to, then we will get accommodations involved in there. Okay, so one of the things that I get asked about is a comprehensive strategy. So here's an example of a comprehensive strategy. I got it from Ernst & Young, honestly. Design a robust and clearly articulated workplace adjustments or accommodations policy using best practices and information or lessons learned from the past. Let's look back to look forward. Develop written guidance and forms that then communicate regularly and clearly to raise awareness amongst all employees. So again, this isn't just for the ones you know have disabilities. Develop tools to document the process, outcomes, and review them for ongoing effectiveness. So review your process as well as whether the accommodations are working. Combine accommodations, communication with overall inclusion expectations and tools for that communication. So again, trying to incorporate inclusion into everything, making disability not stick out so much. Identify resources and expertise that can be utilized on demand as needed. Hey, that just sounds like JAN, doesn't it? Job Accommodation Network. And acknowledge that accommodations are intrinsically related to universal design and accessibility in general, but also are separate topics. And that was my point in the previous slide. So, as an employer, you might be asking, what do I need to know or do? And this is what you need to know or do. That every one of the examples I'm about to give you was an accommodation devised through an interactive conversation with the employee and the manager, at least. HR was involved in a lot of them, and not all of them were successful. And or they were the second or third attempt at finding a good solution. So let's go through them. Accommodation examples. Do you remember in the beginning when I said that a lot of accommodations have turned into things that we all benefit from? Everybody here, whether we have a disability that it was built for or not. Here's a few examples. Cell phones, texting, Alexa or all of your voice command systems, closed captioning on TV, elevators, ramps, and the electric stapler are all examples of things that started out being accommodations for people with disabilities to make life easier for them or make their jobs easier for them. And they are things that we realized were a good idea for everybody to be able to use. Here's a great example. A maintenance department covers the responsibility of physical maintenance of a building and the automation equipment within it. The entire department is 60 people split across all shifts 24/7. Accommodations needed for a couple of workers caused a manager to gauge how many people could have the same accommodation on the same shift, and it was still considered reasonable. So they had a worker, one of the tasks was to change the light bulbs up in the ceiling of a 100-foot ceiling of a room that had a 100-foot ceiling. And so you had to use a piece of equipment called a cherry picker to get up there to change the light bulb. This doesn't happen very frequently, but when it happens, when a light bulb goes out, you've got to be able to change it regularly, quickly. And so because there are multiple people on every single shift, it was not necessary that every person on every shift could operate the cherry picker. And there were a couple of people with disabilities, and due to their disability, they were incapable or unable to learn how to use a forklift, a cherry picker. Sorry, not a forklift, a cherry picker to change the light bulbs up in the 100-foot ceiling. And so this maintenance manager really enjoyed those workers who had that particular restriction. There were a couple of them, and he said, well, I wonder can I get more of these workers? How many people with this specific restriction can I include in my schedule, my work schedule, knowing, so he did the math and figured he actually defined what was reasonable for his department. That was really great. I love that example. But it was all about deciding what's an essential task and what's not an essential function of a job, and then working around that. But knowing that it's a sort of a common thing to not be able to use this cherry picker for people with a variety of different disabilities, and he wanted to be very inclusive. So it was a really cool example. Next example is an employee asked permanently to work from home because of their health concerns. I got this from the last webinar I did, related to potential exposure to COVID. They had pre-existing conditions that made them more susceptible. This is still an example that we may be coming up. They used the specific terms reasonable accommodation and made the request as soon as they were aware that the company was making plans to bring the workforce back to the office. Now, in this case, the folks who are in charge of the process were a little suspicious about this person and whether this was really a legitimate need. So they did go through the process of getting the medical documentation from the person requesting the accommodation, and they ended up granting it. They had some suspicions, followed their process to get the medical information, and realized it was definitely something that was needed. So, it's these processes, sometimes they give us different answers than what we thought we were looking for. Anyway, I included this information from the person who was in that last webinar. Another example, an employee asked to be permitted to use a chair on a factory floor due to back injury related issues. The doctor sent a note restricting standing and bending to 15 minutes or less within 2-hour period. So they could not stand or bend 15 minutes consistently with every 2-hour period. So they wanted a chair, but the way they operated in this factory, it really was not very reasonable to have this accommodation, to have a chair there. They couldn't move from workstation to workstation. It really became, they weren't successful. They weren't productive enough. So we attempted to make this again from another webinar where an employer was saying, we attempted to make this work, but to be productive, employees need to move from workstation to workstation and rather quickly. And this employee was unable to reposition that chair at a good speed. And I admit we were skeptical and anticipated that production would be a problem with this accommodation, but we wanted to give the employee a chance to use this accommodation. It just didn't work. They even tried a wheeled chair, but it didn't make the transition wasn't a smooth place to get the chair from one place to another in the workstations that the employees need to go to. So didn't work out, but they gave it a shot. They terminated the employee, and they're in litigation. Well, I haven't checked in with them, but in 2021 they were in litigation, and it makes them hesitant. They admitted that it makes them hesitant to employ people with physical disabilities, especially back injuries, because it was such a challenge. Okay, so here's another example. An employee with seasonal affective disorder requested to be transferred to work from the company's Houston office. Transferred to work from the company's Houston office. I'm sorry, they were in a different office to begin with. The request included asking the company to pay for the expense of the transfer, their relocation expenses. It's a very large company, but this cost was determined to be unreasonable, and the alternatives were offered. That they get an adjusted work schedule to maximize access to daylight hours. The light box was purchased by the company for this worker to use. Their desk was located by a window so they could absorb as much natural sunlight as possible. But ultimately, the employee decided to leave the job. So interesting scenario to go through. Here's some other examples. Let's talk through these. Assigning or moving offices. So there are times when somebody needs to be in a different space, whether it has to do with windows or not windows, or a door that can close or cubbies, those sorts of things, depending on whether it's distractions we're talking about or all other sorts of barriers. Assigning and moving offices is a very reasonable accommodation in most cases. It gets clunky when we're talking about moving them into an office where people of some level of seniority, and I have air quotes around the word seniority there, it's a privilege to have those offices. And so if it's an accommodation, it really kind of rocks people. And again, this isn't necessarily supportive of an inclusive work environment when that kind of privilege is included in, but in general, assigning and moving offices is a very reasonable thing to ask for. Putting up partitions in open workspaces so that we can dampen sound or limit the distraction, visual distractions. Putting in a ramp where there's steps. Job coaches, allowing job coaches. So back to the applicants and the candidates thing, idea of asking for quite reasonable accommodations. I did work with a company once where they required medical documentation for a job seeker to be allowed to have a job coach help them, accompany them during an interview, which is a very reasonable request as long as you understand what the job coach's role is. There was no expense on the part of the company for the job coach to come there, but they were so rigid about their process. It really prevented a lot of people with disabilities from bothering to go through their application process because of that. They went and got jobs somewhere else. So that company just couldn't overcome the concept that they were limiting themselves with their pipeline of inclusion by requiring this when it was an accommodation that didn't have any cost involved, and the parameters around it were put up there that the job coach would need to define what service they were providing. They couldn't answer questions for the candidates. They were just there to provide clarity on both sides to help serve as a communication translator or prompter. Anyway, so job coach is very reasonable. There are very certain instances where job coaches can be restricted. And one of them is if it is a safety concern, how many people can be on a dock. I've been in a lot of distribution environments, and sometimes the job coaches need to position themselves differently if they're going to provide support. What they're providing needs to be defined, and a good schedule of when they're going to be withdrawing that, really sort of fading that away. There's a lot of parameters around job coaches as an accommodation, but in general, it makes sense. One other exception, if it's a union environment, they cannot do any of the techniques that job coaches typically do to demonstrate how to do something. They can't touch the box. So again, distribution environment, but it was a union thing. You couldn't touch the product that was being moved. So if they wanted to teach somebody how to properly touch the box, move the box, whatever, all they could do is put their hands over the employee's hands and then show them how to position the box so that it went through the system properly. So anyway, wearing headphones. A lot of times that's a safety restriction, but some people need it to keep pace or to limit the distractibility of voices in their head or some of the noise. And so I've seen the compromises of them wearing noise canceling headphones when they're at their desk, but they have to remove them, or the workstation, you have to remove them when they're moving around the facility so that we promote the safety. So again, it can be reasonable. Adaptive keyboards, permitting service animals, that's only tricky if somebody's allergic. Electric stapler, I already covered that one. Closed captioning, I covered that. Phones with T-coil compatibility, meaning that they link into a cochlear implant or a hearing aid so that the sound goes directly into the part of the hearing system that receives that information. Ergonomics, I don't need to talk about that. Permitted to keep juice at a workstation. This is especially for people who are diabetic or have other health conditions where juice instead of just water is allowed at their workstation, so they don't need to leave the workstation to be able to have some juice. However, there are some places where that's not reasonable for them to have the juice there, and so the reasonable accommodation is for them to be able to leave the workstation, go get a sip from a cooler somewhere, and then come back. Calculators for people who can't do the math in their heads. That's not just for people with particular disabilities, might be for all of us. Talking to money identifier. So there's a lot of blind vendors. And so they needed a device that could read the dollar bill or the $10 bill or the $5 bill and say what it is so that they can make sure they're making change properly. Not so big in the credit card world that we live in now. A reading pen, it's something that you put on top of a word so it reads the word to you great for people who are dyslexic or have trouble seeing, magnifiers, a braille printer, sign language interpreters. I think we're pretty common with that. If you don't know what that is, I apologize. It's for people who are deaf and use sign language to speak, and the other person who they're talking to does not speak sign language. Meeting etiquette rules. So some companies are setting up these really great inclusive meeting etiquette rules, like creating an agenda ahead of time, making sure people only speak one at a time, distributing the balance of responsibility within running meetings, all sorts of things for inclusion. Vehicle hand controls. So if you have to drive a car for work, and it's part of your work responsibilities to drive that car or a truck, getting hand controls put in if you can't use your feet to drive. So what else do we have here? Examples of invisible accommodations. This is something I wanted to touch on. Flexible work hours, remote work options, modified break schedules, job restructuring, part-time work options, quiet workspaces, flexible leave policies, shift changes, task sequencing flexibility. That one I love so much. So many companies are stuck on their standard operating procedures, and if you don't do the things in this particular order, then you're doing it wrong. But if you're getting the same output and it's easier and faster and better, why do we care how they got there? It's like when we did math tests way back in my day, we just show our work. We couldn't just give the answer and to show how we got the answer. Anyway, task sequencing flexibility is a great accommodation for people whose brains work differently. Work from home setup assistance. So not just saying you're going to work from home, but we're going to help you get things all set up, like in my office. You need to get my printer connected to my laptop. Priority parking, a gradual return to work schedule, performance review adjustments, meaning that we're going to do this more frequently or in a different format. Emergency evacuation plans, making sure that people have what they need to be successful during and safe during an emergency evacuation, whether it's a drill or whether it's a real scenario, having that set up ahead of time. Modified training materials, so either if they're in print, giving them in video or in audio, or if they're only in audio, giving them in print or in video demonstrations versus just speaking. Modifying training materials so that people's learning styles are adhered to. And that's great for everybody, not just for people with disabilities. Alternative communication methods, using electronic means for communication, like texting or boards where you identify and then it speaks for you. I forget what those are called. But if you don't have the ability to voice your thoughts, the board does it for you and you just program it in. Meeting accommodations. So either where you're having the meeting or how you're having the meeting, all sorts of accommodations related to meetings. Adjustments to dress code. So some people, for a myriad of reasons related to their disability, cannot wear what you typically require of people. And so it's being reasonable within that. Conflict resolution support. So if somebody really has trouble with advocacy, advocating for themselves, and they're in a conflicted situation at work, providing somebody who helps them with that, who can work with them about the emotional or whatever constraints they have in being able to resolve conflict on their own. Having a later start, depending on what the job requires. Not working from home. Some people require, that stimulation of being in an office and not working from home. So can they always work from the office, or do they have to be in the rotating schedule? Anxiety kits. So people who have issues with anxiety sometimes have a kit that they use to manage their anxiety when their anxiety is getting really high and preventing them from being successful. So there are so many more examples. I'm going to let you just go. I have a guide that's searchable, a shrank down version of what Jan offers. I'm telling you, go to www.askjan.org and you will find the answers to just about any example you need of people with disabilities and the accommodations that work for them. Q&A discussion. I think I've run us out of time. But here's my email address. I am happy to take those questions anytime you've got them about accommodations. Please feel free to email me. And do not forget about askjan.org, www.askjan.org. They are the ultimate experts in this. They're free, they're confidential, they've been doing this forever, and I can't say enough about them being a great resource. So I hope you found the kind of information you were looking for in this webinar. I appreciate everybody's participation. You were a pretty big group, so that was great. Your comments, there were a couple of questions privately sent to me in the chat. I will respond to those tomorrow, give you the responses that you're looking for, or the information that you're looking for. So thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great day. Bye-bye.